In 1982, 3 elderly women vanished without a trace from their quiet retirement community. But 30 years later, during routine renovation work beneath a small-town church, a discovery would emerge that would shatter everything investigators thought they knew about that autumn night. The discovery would launch an investigation that would expose a web of secrets, betrayal, and a truth so disturbing that it would forever change how a community viewed their town for over 40 years. Margaret. Chen had never given up hope. 30 years after her mother disappeared, along with 2 other women from Sunset Manor retirement community, she still drove past the old building every few months, as if somehow the answers might reveal themselves in the fading brick facade or overgrown gardens. Her mother, Dorothy Chen, had been 73 years old when she vanished. A retired librarian with a sharp mind and stronger opinions, Dorothy had been one of 3 women who simply weren't in their rooms when staff made evening rounds on October 15, 1982. Along with her had disappeared Eleanor Vasquez, a 70-year-old former seamstress, and Ruth Morrison, a retired teacher who had just celebrated her 75th birthday the week before. The initial investigation had been thorough, but ultimately fruitless. All 3 women's belongings remained in their rooms. Their medications sat untouched on nightstands. There were no signs of struggle, no indication of planned departure. Security was minimal in 1982, a single night guard who made hourly rounds and spent most of his time reading magazines at the front desk. Detective James Walsh, now retired himself, had worked the case for over a decade before finally admitting defeat. The women had simply vanished, as if they had never existed at all. Theories ranged from voluntary departure to foul play, but without bodies or evidence, the case remained an open wound in the community's collective memory. Margaret had been 42 when her mother disappeared, a single woman working as a nurse at the local hospital. She had visited Dorothy twice a week, bringing books and homemade soup, sharing gossip from the outside world. Their relationship had been complicated. Dorothy was demanding and critical, never quite satisfied with her daughter's life choices. But Margaret had loved her fiercely. The disappearance had consumed Margaret's life in ways she hadn't anticipated. She took leave from work to help with the investigation, plastering missing person flyers across 3 counties. She hired private investigators with money she couldn't afford to spend. She attended every community meeting, every press conference, every prayer vigil organized by well-meaning neighbors. As years passed and hope faded, Margaret had slowly rebuilt her life around the absence. She returned to work, eventually becoming head nurse at the hospital. She dated occasionally, though. Relationships rarely lasted long. How do you explain to someone that you're still searching for a ghost? She bought a small house 3 blocks from the retirement home, close enough to feel connected to her mother's last known location. But the discovery beneath St. Matthew's Episcopal Church on a cold March morning in 2012 would change everything. Father Michael Santos had served St. Matthew's for over 40 years. He had arrived as a young priest in 1971, full of idealism and energy, determined to serve his small congregation with dedication and compassion. By 2012, he was 74 years old. His once dark hair now completely white, his hands arthritic, but still steady enough to perform the sacred rituals he had conducted thousands of times. The church building itself dated back to 1952, a modest structure with a simple altar and stained glass windows donated by prominent families in the community. Over the decades, Father Santos had overseen various improvements and renovations, always working within the constraints of a limited budget and a congregation that valued tradition over innovation. The renovation project that would change everything had been planned for months. The church's foundation had been settling unevenly, causing cracks in the walls and making the building unsafe for regular use. A construction crew had been hired to reinforce the foundation and install proper drainage around the structure. It was Tommy Hernandez, a 26-year-old construction worker, who made the discovery that Tuesday morning. He had been using a pneumatic drill to break up the concrete beneath the altar when his tool hit something that didn't belong. Instead of solid earth or building materials, he encountered what felt like plastic sheeting wrapped around substantial objects. Tommy's first instinct was to call his supervisor, thinking perhaps they had encountered old construction materials or abandoned storage. But as they carefully excavated the area, it became clear that what they had found was far more significant. 3 large plastic bags, each containing what appeared to be a complete set of women's clothing, jewelry, and personal effects. The supervisor immediately called the police, and within an hour, the small church was swarming with investigators. Detective Lisa Morrison, no relation to the missing Ruth Morrison, had only been with the department for 5 years, but she recognized immediately that this discovery could be connected to the decades-old cold case that still haunted the community. The bags were carefully removed and transported to the county forensics lab. Inside, investigators found 3 complete outfits: dresses, undergarments, shoes, and jewelry. More significantly, they found 3 purses containing driver's licenses, Social Security cards, and small amounts of cash. The names on the identification cards sent shockwaves through the investigation team: Dorothy Chen, Eleanor Vasquez, and Ruth Morrison. The clothing had been remarkably well preserved, protected by the plastic wrapping and the stable temperature beneath the church floor. Forensic analysis would later reveal that the plastic bags dated to the early 1980s, consistent with the timeline of the women's disappearance. More disturbing was the discovery that the concrete floor above the hiding place had been recently poured sometime in late 1982 or early 1983. Margaret received the call from Detective Morrison on a Thursday afternoon as she was finishing her shift at the hospital. The detective's voice was careful, professional, but Margaret could sense the underlying tension in her words. "Mrs. Chen, we'd like you to come down to the station. We've found some items that may be connected to your mother's case." Margaret's hands began shaking before she had even hung up the phone. After 30 years of waiting, of hoping, of dreading this exact moment, she found herself completely unprepared for the reality of it. She drove to the police station in a daze, her mind cycling through possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. At the station, Detective Morrison led her into a small conference room where several evidence bags were laid out on a table. Margaret recognized her mother's clothing immediately, the blue dress with small white flowers that Dorothy had been particularly fond of, the pearl earrings that had belonged to Margaret's grandmother, the worn leather purse that had been Dorothy's. Constant companion for over a decade. "We found these beneath the floor of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church," Detective Morrison explained gently, "along with similar items belonging to Eleanor Vasquez and Ruth Morrison. We're treating this as a homicide investigation now." Margaret stared at the evidence bags, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing, her mother's clothes preserved, as if she had just taken them off, waiting patiently beneath a church floor for 3 decades. The implications were staggering. Someone had taken these women, removed their clothing, and carefully hidden the evidence in what should have been sacred ground. "Do you think—" Margaret's voice caught in her throat. "Do you think they suffered?" Detective Morrison had investigated enough homicides to know that this question would haunt the families forever, regardless of how she answered. "We're going to find out exactly what happened," she said instead. "I promise you that. The investigation that followed would consume the next 6 months of Margaret's life." DNA analysis confirmed that the clothing had belonged to the 3 missing women. Forensic examination revealed no obvious signs of violence on the garments, but after 30 years, many potential clues had been lost to time and the elements. The focus quickly turned to St. Matthew's Episcopal Church and anyone who would have had access to the building during the crucial time period. Father Santos, now the primary person of interest, initially cooperated fully with the investigation. He provided detailed records of church activities from 1982 submitted to questioning and allowed investigators to search his residence and office. But as the investigation deepened, inconsistencies began to emerge in Father Santos's account of events from that October night 30 years earlier. Father Santos had always been a pillar of the community. In 4 decades of service, he had baptized generations of children, officiated at hundreds of weddings, and provided comfort to countless families during their darkest hours. His congregation trusted him implicitly, viewing him not just as their spiritual leader, but as a friend and confidant. The accusations that began to surface as the investigation progressed seemed impossible to reconcile with the man they knew. Father Santos was quiet, studious, dedicated to his faith and his flock. He lived modestly in the small rectory behind the church, spent his free time reading theological texts and tending to a small garden. He had never married, had no family. Beyond his congregation, and seemed to find genuine fulfillment in his life of service. But Detective Morrison's investigation revealed a different picture. Financial records showed that Father Santos had made several large cash deposits in the months following the women's disappearance, deposits that he claimed came from anonymous donations, but could not adequately document. More troubling were the testimonies that began to emerge from former parishioners who had left the church over the years. Maria Gutierrez, now in her 70s, had been a regular parishioner in the early 1980s. She told investigators about uncomfortable encounters with Father Santos during confession, times when his questions became too personal, too focused on intimate details of her marriage and personal life. She had eventually stopped attending services, she said, because something about the priest's demeanor made her feel unsafe. Similar stories emerged from other women who had known Father Santos during the early years of his ministry. All was subtle, all was ambiguous enough to dismiss as misunderstanding or imagination. A hand that lingered too long during communion, questions that probed too deeply into personal matters. A pattern of behavior that, viewed individually, seemed innocent enough, but taken together, painted a disturbing picture. The breakthrough in the case came when investigators discovered a safety deposit box registered to Father Santos at a bank 3 towns away. Inside, they found detailed journals spanning over 40 years, written in the priest's careful handwriting. The entries revealed a man struggling with desires and impulses that conflicted fundamentally with his religious vows and public persona. The journal entries from October 1982 were particularly revealing. Father Santos had written extensively about 3 elderly women from the retirement community who had begun attending evening services at St. Matthew's. He described their vulnerability, their loneliness, their trust in his spiritual authority. And he described a plan that would allow him to fulfill fantasies he had been suppressing for decades. The confrontation between Detective Morrison and Father Santos took place on a gray November morning in the same church where the evidence had been discovered 8 months earlier. The priest sat in the front pew, his hands folded in his lap, staring at the altar where he had conducted services for 41 years. "We found your journals, Father," Detective Morrison said quietly, taking a seat beside him. "We know what happened to Dorothy, Eleanor, and Ruth." Father Santos was silent for a long moment, his breathing shallow and labored. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I never meant for it to happen the way it did." The confession that followed would reveal the horrific truth about that October night in 1982. Father Santos had been conducting evening services specifically designed to attract the elderly residents of Sunset Manor, offering them a sense of community and spiritual comfort that many found lacking in their institutional environment. Dorothy, Eleanor, and Ruth had become regular attendees, staying after services to talk with the priest about their fears, their loneliness, their approaching mortality. Father Santos had used their trust to lure them to the church that final evening, claiming there was a special service planned in their honor. Once they arrived, however, his true intentions became clear. He had drugged their coffee with sleeping pills stolen from the retirement home's medical supplies, then transported them to a remote cabin he owned in the mountains. What happened? At the cabin over the next 3 days was something Father Santos claimed he could barely remember, as if his mind had blocked out the worst details even as he was committing them. The women had died, he said, not from violence, but from a combination of the drugs and the shock of their situation. He had panicked, realizing that his life of service and respect was over, that he would spend the rest of his days in prison. Okikos lama chuftramidia. Decision to bury their bodies in the mountains and hide their clothing beneath the church floor had been made in desperation. He had hoped that without bodies or evidence, the disappearances would eventually be forgotten, filed away as one of those tragic mysteries that occasionally touched small communities. For 30 years, his plan had worked. He had continued his ministry, comforting the very families who grieved for the women he had killed. He had officiated at memorial services, offered prayers for their safe return, and provided spiritual counsel to Margaret Chen as she struggled with the loss of her mother. "I prayed every day for forgiveness," Father Santos whispered, as Detective Morrison placed him under arrest. "I thought God would find a way to let me atone for what I had done." The revelation of Father Santos's crimes sent shockwaves through the community that extended far beyond the immediate families of the victims. For 4 decades, this man had been their trusted spiritual leader, the person they turned to in times of crisis, the keeper of their most intimate secrets. The betrayal felt profound and personal to every member of his congregation. Margaret found herself struggling with emotions she hadn't anticipated. The relief of finally knowing what had happened to her mother was overwhelming, but it was complicated by a rage so intense it frightened her. For 30 years, she had sat in the same pew where Father Santos delivered his sermons, had shaken his hand after services, had even found comfort in his words during her darkest moments of grief. "He knew what he had done to my mother," Margaret told Detective Morrison during one of their final meetings, "and he looked me in the eye every Sunday and pretended to care about my pain. How does someone live with that kind of deception?" The legal proceedings that followed were swift but thorough. Father Santos pled guilty to 3 counts of second-degree murder, accepting a life sentence without the possibility of parole. At 74 years old, it was effectively a death sentence, though he would spend his remaining years in prison rather than facing execution. During the sentencing hearing, Margaret had the opportunity to address Father Santos directly. She had written a statement weeks earlier, crafting and recrafting her words, trying to find a way to express 30 years of grief, anger, and confusion. But when the moment came, she found herself setting aside her prepared remarks and speaking from her heart. "You stole more than my mother's life," she told him, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "You stole my ability to trust, my faith in human goodness, my belief that the people we're supposed to trust most are actually worthy of that trust. But you didn't steal my love for her, and you didn't steal my determination to see justice done." Father Santos listened without reaction, his face impassive, his hands folded in his lap, in the same position Detective Morrison had found him in at the church. When Margaret finished speaking, he looked up at her briefly, and she saw something in his eyes that might have been remorse, or might have been simply exhaustion. The search for the women's bodies began immediately after Father Santos's confession. But the remote cabin he described had been sold years earlier, and the new owners had made substantial changes to the property. Despite extensive searches using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, the remains of Dorothy Chen, Eleanor Vasquez, and Ruth Morrison were never recovered. For Margaret, this remained the most painful aspect of the entire ordeal. She had waited 30 years to learn what happened to her mother, only to discover that she might never have the closure of a proper burial. The knowledge of her mother's fate was both a blessing and a curse. It answered the questions that had haunted her for decades, but it also forced her to confront the horrible reality of her mother's final days. The families of Eleanor Vasquez and Ruth Morrison faced similar struggles. Eleanor's daughter, Carmen, had moved across the country years earlier, building a new life while trying to escape the pain of her mother's disappearance. Ruth's son, David, had died in a car accident 5 years after his mother's disappearance, taking with him the hope that she might someday return home. But the discovery of the truth, however painful, allowed the community to begin a process of healing that had been impossible while the mystery remained unsolved. Memorial services were held for all 3 women, providing their families and friends with the opportunity to properly grieve and celebrate their lives. Margaret organized the service for her mother, choosing to hold it not at St. Matthew's, which had been forever tainted by Father Santos's crimes, but at the small chapel at the retirement home where Dorothy had spent her final months. She invited everyone who had known her mother, sharing stories and memories that painted a picture of a complex but loving woman who had been taken too soon. "My mother was not a perfect person," Margaret said during her eulogy. "She was stubborn and opinionated and sometimes difficult to love. But she was my mother, and she deserved better than what happened to her. She deserved to die peacefully, surrounded by people who cared about her, not in fear and confusion at the hands of someone she trusted." The service provided Margaret with something she hadn't experienced in 30 years, a sense of closure. Not complete closure, perhaps, but enough to allow her to begin moving forward with her life in a way that had been impossible while her mother's fate remained unknown. In the months following Father Santos's conviction, Margaret made several significant changes to her life. She retired from nursing, using her savings and a settlement from the church's insurance company to buy a small bookstore in the downtown area. She chose books as her new profession, partly because of her mother's love of reading, but mostly because she wanted to surround herself with stories that ended properly, with mysteries solved and justice served. The bookstore became a gathering place for others in the community who were struggling to process the revelations about Father Santos. Margaret found herself serving as an unofficial counselor, listening to customers share their own experiences of betrayal and loss, helping them work through the complicated emotions that arise when someone you trusted proves unworthy of that trust. She also began writing, first in a journal, recording her thoughts and memories about her mother and the long search for answers, then eventually crafting those experiences into a book that would help other families dealing with similar losses. The writing process was both painful and therapeutic, forcing her to examine not just the horror of what had happened, but also the strength she had discovered within herself during the 3 decades of uncertainty. On the first anniversary of the discovery beneath the church, Margaret drove to the cemetery where her mother's headstone had been placed, even though her body had never been recovered. She brought flowers, white lilies, her mother's favorite, and spent the afternoon telling Dorothy about the bookstore, about the people she had met, about the life she was finally able to live without the constant weight of unanswered questions. "Oh, miss you every day," she said to the headstone. "But I'm not angry anymore. I'm not consumed by the need to find you. I know what happened. And I know it wasn't your fault, and I know you would want me to be happy." As she walked back to her car, Margaret realized that for the first time in 30 years, she felt genuinely optimistic about the future. The discovery of the truth had been devastating in many ways, but it had also freed her from the limbo that had defined her adult life. She could grieve properly now, and then she could move forward. The case of the 3 missing women became a cautionary tale about the dangers of blind trust and the importance of questioning authority, even in institutions that society considers sacred. But for Margaret, it became something more, proof that persistence and determination can eventually overcome even the most carefully constructed deceptions, and that truth, however painful, is always preferable to uncertainty. Father Michael. Santos died in prison 18 months after his conviction, taking with him whatever additional secrets he might have harbored. His death meant that some questions would remain forever unanswered. But by then, Margaret had learned to live with ambiguity in a way that would have been impossible during the long years of not knowing anything at all. The small bookstore continues to operate today, serving as both a business and a memorial to 3 women whose lives were cut short by betrayal and violence. On quiet afternoons, Margaret can sometimes be found in the back corner, reading to children who gather for story time, sharing tales of courage and justice and the power of truth to overcome even the darkest deceptions.